Hello.
As a relatively new Mac user, I've discovered that I can keep my Mac running quick and secure with Clean My Mac X, whether it's fully optimizing the system with a smart scan or my favorite, the uninstall utility that completely uninstalls unwanted apps, removing even the pieces that Mac can leave behind. Clean My Mac X is the first app I install on my Mac computers. For more information or to get your copy of Clean My Mac X, click the link in the description below.
Hey guys, welcome to Elevated Systems. I'm your host CJ. A few months ago, as part of my M1 Mac Mini review, I did a video on using the Mac for 3D design. In that video, I tested Fusion 360 for some 3D CAD work, Cura for slicing 3D components, and some ArchViz in SketchUp. That was one of my more popular Mac videos, and I got a lot of requests to test other 3D programs. So now that I'm taking a look at the M1 powered iMac, I have that opportunity. So today I'll be taking a look at zBrush, Maya, Blender, Cinema 4D, and the V-Ray and Corona renderers, with the ultimate goal of helping you decide if the 24-inch iMac is a good choice for your 3D workflow. Whether that's a professional workflow or if you're just a 3D design hobbyist. Now, I'm covering 4 pretty complex programs, so obviously I can't cover every aspect of each of these programs. Also, I ended up with hours of video of the projects I worked on, so for time's sake, I'll be going through just the key highlights pretty quickly here. So as always, there are plenty of chapter markers so you can jump to points of interest. And if I'm fast forwarding through a section you want to take a closer look at, you can always slow down the playback speed. Also, I'm approaching this with the mindset that the audience, you guys, have some working knowledge of the software I'm using, so I'm not going to show you every single step or explain every term. For example, if in zBrush I say, and 5 subdivisions later we have this, you understand the mesh subdivision process. I don't have to show you all the progress across all 5 subdivisions. Or in Maya I say I had to relink all the textures and then skip to the zine with all the textures loaded. You have an understanding of the texture manager, and you're happy I didn't show you me going through my asset archives, finding missing bitmaps, and relinking them to the lights and textures in the scene.
I'll start with zBrush because I think the iMac and the M1 is well suited for the CPU exclusive workload of zBrush. I started by pulling in a human base mesh. This is Ben, and he consists of about 38,000 polygons and is divided into multiple polygroups. Unfortunately, after years of anonymously trolling creators on the internet, Ben didn't age well. He still lives in his parents' basement, is known as Trolley now. I was able to achieve this with just a single subdivision and a few brushes, including clay buildup, inflate, and the move brushes. Trolley's up to 154,000 polys, but I was able to divide the mesh much further and sculpt in more detail, and I pulled in some pre-modeled and textured assets for the eyes and teeth, bringing the model to nearly 10 million polygons and still zero lag or performance loss. I started sculpting some physical texture on Trolley, and using a mask and the extract tool, I gave Trolley some rudimentary clothing, and even with over 17 million polygons active in the workspace, I was still able to sculpt fine details in real time, no lag or spinny rainbow delay. With most of the sculpting done, I poly painted the whole model. I didn't expect any issues here, as poly painting doesn't add polygons to the model, and the viewport kept up as I laid down multiple layers and used various ambient inclusion masks and brushes to paint the pale basement dwelling troll. And of course, like every troll, we need to finish him off with copious amounts of Cheetos dust he's always covered in. Okay, maybe that was too far, but I did complete the model with a stubbly beard and big bushy eyebrows using fiber mesh, and even at almost 18 million polys, I'm still able to use a groom brush on the fiber mesh with zero lag. And with the model done, let's take a better look with a BPR or best preview render. And a close detail view takes 23 seconds. And this is a full resolution look at the results. And a more distant BPR takes about 18 seconds. And again, here are the results of that. Now, finally in ZBrush, I did use the UV master to unwrap Trolley, and from that create a texture map and a normal map.
But this is really where my ZBrush knowledge is lacking a bit, because I never do UV map work in ZBrush. I just wanted to test it, and it did unwrap the model and flatten and lay out the islands in seconds, but I wasn't really happy with the results, and I don't really know how to fix it in ZBrush, because I always do all my UV map work in Maya, because for me, Maya's UV editor is, well, the best, but I'm not gonna mess with Trolley's UV map. Cutting and laying out UVs is, well, boring.
Instead, I did bring Trolley into Maya, and I was able to retopologize the model, so I have a very nice low quad poly model. Of course, if I did take some time with the UVs, I could now use those textures and normal maps to have a good low poly high detail model to use as an animation asset. But to animate, first you need a rig, so going back to the high poly model, I just used Maya's quick rig tool, and Maya and the M1 processor didn't miss a beat and almost perfectly created and bound the rig. And it worked pretty well. Of course, there were areas where skin weights would need to be adjusted or repainted, but for the most part, it worked. Now, this is where you'd adjust the rig and the skin weights, add your control handles, and that was my plan, ultimately doing a short keyframe animation. But in the middle of this, I got a notification that Chaos Group put out a V-Ray update for Maya 2022, and that's what most of you were asking about, V-Ray workflow and rendering. So I changed gears and loaded in one of my old V-Ray Maya scenes. Now, before I start explaining the project, it's important to explain that neither Maya or V-Ray are optimized for M1 yet, so we're translated via Rosetta 2, and it's not perfect. A glaring example is the garbled menu help pop-ups on most of the menu items. Annoying, but not detrimental. Okay. Of course, the scene came in without the materials or textures linked for most of the assets, but I just started by doing some look dev, quickly adding in some of the V-Ray materials from the library and adjusting the lighting to see how the real-time viewport renderer responded, and it didn't do too bad. Now, V-Ray is really optimized and even designed for hardware acceleration, specifically CUDA acceleration, so if you're a serious V-Ray artist, well, then you're probably not watching this because you have an NVIDIA GPU system, but the M1 did an okay job. I could see the textures for the most part. I could see, for example, the brick material on the lower part of the wall was a bad choice because my UV map wasn't properly scaled for it, and I could see that none of my lighting adjustments were responding because, oops, the HDR maps I was using for the lights were also not linked. So I spent some time going through my workstation to find the missing assets and brought them into the project and relinked them all. And ultimately, I ended up with what looked like a good textured and lit scene, so it was time to render an image, and I started with the default settings bucket render, a noise threshold of 0.005, no denoising element, and a default light cache GI. And then I rendered the still. The light cache built quickly, but then took what seemed like a long time to merge the passes. but the rendering eventually started, and you can see that there are 8 render buckets, so all 4 of the big cores and all 4 of the little cores are all rendering a full bucket. Until it gets to a section where the sample rate gets very high, like the glass crystals in the lamp. Then the 4 little cores join forces to render a single 64 pixel bucket, each taking 16 pixels. This does increase rendering time, but I did notice the 4 small cores rendered each 64 pixel bucket significantly faster than a single big core. Ultimately, the render took 1 hour and 46 seconds, but didn't come out perfect. You can see all the white dots everywhere. Again, these are in areas with higher sample rates and are a result of problems with color mapping in the reflection layer. This is something I've seen in the past, and while there are ways to deal with it, it usually leads to other problems, and honestly, I haven't used bucket rendering in years, so let's move on to progressive rendering. And this time, I'll reduce the noise threshold and add a denoiser. At about 2 minutes in, and we see we're already almost at the fidelity of the bucket renderer. There's still a lot of noise in the reflections and refractions, so 15 minutes, it looks great, but I forgot to apply the denoiser to all the other elements, so post-processing the image won't be too easy, but that was only a 15-minute mistake, not an hour mistake. The final test was another bucket renderer, this time with the denoiser, and I did apply it to all the render elements, or all the compatible ones, and this time the render took 41 minutes. Again, there's still some white spotting, but not as bad, so I can take care of it in Photoshop. And this is the original version of the scene that I rendered out back in 2016 on a Haswell E5960X dual GTX 980 Ti system, and this is the updated scene rendered on the iMac. Both were post-processed in Photoshop. Moving on to Blender, and this is version 2.93, the M1 optimized version, and for this overview I downloaded a scene you've probably all seen, the Junk Shop by Alex Trevino, and I started with a simple polygon modeling, which again is a single chord speed dependent function, so should be perfect for the M1, but very quickly ran into a problem. A big problem. The iMac actually hard locked. I had no control at all and had to do a hard shutdown. And when it restarted, the magic mouse wouldn't reconnect. It eventually did, but I just went with a regular mouse at this point because I just like the middle mouse button for simple panning in the viewport. But I got back into the scene and editing the model was, as expected, seamless. I tried out sculpt mode and this was also very soon, but then again, right here the system hard locked, and again I had to do a hard shutdown, but this time I figured out the cause. What had happened was I attempted to isolate the object, her shirt, in edit mode while I had several individual polygons selected. Now, I make this mistake a lot because I'm a 3ds Max user primarily, and it isn't an issue there. It's not typically an issue on Blender. When you do that in edit mode, typically the object minus the selected polys and the rest of the objects in the scene disappear, and you can just tab into object mode and you have the isolated object. This is apparently a bug I found, and it is repeatable, so I guess be aware. Anyway, I figured that out and I stopped doing it, and I moved on to both viewport rendering, and I started with map preview, which seemed to load in pretty quickly, but at that point the viewport became pretty unresponsive. I'm actively trying to pan and orbit around the viewport right now, and it's barely responding, just 2 jerky movements. So I switched to render preview, and it was more responsive and probably rendered the viewport about as fast as V-Ray in Maya did. Next, I tested the render speed starting with cycles and left the render settings at the file defaults, and the render after denoising took 2 minutes and 17 seconds with what I would call draft results. Next, I switched the render engine to the new eevee engine, and now the viewport was very responsive in both render and material view. And an image render using eevee completes in just 1 minute 35 seconds, and the quality is what I would call highly publishable. This being my first time using the eevee engine, I can say I'm impressed. However, as great as eevee is for some scenes, it just doesn't seem to be compatible with more photorealistic textures in scene. So next I opened up Still Life by Arundel Woodford. This is a more photorealistic scene, and this is also where I really started having screen capture problems with the iMac, but more on that to come in my next video. Anyway, I was able to capture a few seconds at a time, so I went with the final renders here, and using cycles with a noise threshold of 0.5, this scene rendered in 5 minutes and 20 seconds with pretty good results. However, when I tried to render using eevee, after 1 minute and 11, I got back a black screen. Now again, I'm unfamiliar with eevee, but my guess it's a lighting parameters that's the problem. If you guys know how or if it can be fixed, let me know in the comments. For the last render test, I switched back to cycles, and this time with a noise threshold of 0.1, the image rendered in 8 minutes and 52 seconds with much better visual fidelity. This is most noticeable in the background, especially the top left, and in the shadows and boundaries of the foreground.
Okay, so up to this point, despite the Blender bug, I was very impressed with the iMac's performance in these 3D packages, but nothing is perfect, and Cinema 4D, not so much. Now, first, big disclaimer, I'm not a Cinema 4D user. The only thing I ever used and installed C4D for is to convert Cinema 4D assets to 3ds Max assets. So I'm not an SME on the software, but I can tell you the issues I ran into were not in the weeds kind of issues. They were right in your face. First, I already used my trial V-Ray license for Maya, so for C4D, I went with the Corona renderer.
So I grabbed a couple of ArchViz C4D Corona scenes, kind of my wheelhouse, and right off the bat, C4D S24 by the way, couldn't find the Corona plugins, even though they were there and active, and the Corona renderer was also loaded and present. The other issue was opening a new project apparently opened a completely new instance of C4D, and the original instance wouldn't close and had to be force quit. I even reinstalled the latest daily build of Corona, but the issue persisted with more than one scene. Now, you can see the textures are loaded in the material preview for a split second, and then they all go blank.
Now, I did check and all the bitmaps were present and linked, so it does seem like it's just the plugin is not being properly loaded. I did some research online, and this seems to be a hit or miss problem. It works fine for some, and others have the same plugin not found issue.
Now, I did play around with some simple C4D models like this Toyota Supra, and the native C4D materials seemed to work just fine, and I was able to export the model as an object file.
And honestly, again, that's as far as I've taken my Cinema 4D workflow, but if someone has the solution to the Corona renderer problem or knows what I did wrong, let me know in the comments. That was Corona version 7, the 5 June 2021 daily build, and the first attempt was the latest stable version from the main product download page. I think that's Corona 6 Hotfix 2. But that is the end of the demo and testing portion of this video, so let's move on to the conclusion part. And can the iMac do 3D? Yes, the M1 iMac can do 3D, but at varying levels of proficiency. First, the overwhelming strong points of the M1 chip overall in the 3D workflow is modeling. Polygon modeling is a strictly single core speed dependent operation. It's like Photoshop. The faster the CPU, the better it'll support polygon modeling in virtually any 3D design software. zBrush is probably the best example of that today. I probably have the most zBrush use on an Intel Extreme Edition i7-5960X system, and even overclocked to 4.7, 4.8 gigahertz, that system didn't perform as smoothly as this while sculpting in zBrush. And that goes for polygon modeling in most software. Even the max 16 gigs of RAM is gonna be plenty for most people. Quick math in my head, I think 16 gigabytes is something like between 500 and 600 million polygons. Of course, your textures and UVA data takes up room too, but I don't think memory is going to be a significant issue for most typical 3D modeling projects. However, if you're getting into the animation side, memory can start to be a limiting factor. But again, if you're simply rigging, well, even complexly rigging and doing the keyframing, even scripting and animation, then this will do that job with little to no difficulty. Now, texturing, lighting, and rendering, which for me all go hand in hand, this is where your workflow will start to be limited. Now, again, different degrees of limitation. If you're doing static scenes like the ballet scene or ArchViz like I used to do, then you can definitely do it on this iMac. But if I'm being honest, for $1,800, you can get a system that will do it much better, especially if you're a V-Ray artist. Like I said, V-Ray is built for NVIDIA graphics cards, and unfortunately, even before the M1, NVIDIA and Apple, that's just like the Hatfields and McCoys. I'll just say this, I became so much better of a texture artist and my renders improved so much once I built that workstation and could adjust a material, tweak a UV scale, shift an HDR texture on a dome light, and see it all happen in the viewport in real time. I didn't have to guess and then do a draft render to see if the changes were good. Real-time viewport rendering, for me anyway, has become an essential part of my workflow, and this iMac just isn't powerful enough to do it in a meaningful way. Again, all relative. If you're in the style of the junkyard, then this is okay, but you can do better for the price. And I guess final point, just like I said in my final summary review of the Mac Mini, when you adopt new bleeding edge tech like the M1, the stuff you know and love might not always work like you know and love it to. Of the 6 softwares I tested, 4 3D apps and 2 renderers, only 1 was optimized for the M1, Blender, and I actually found a repeatable bug in that. Something as easy as a Shift-H before tabbing back to object mode can crash the system. I couldn't get Corona to work at all, but again, others seem to have been able to. Point is, there are growing pains that come with new technology. Apple isn't immune to that, just like every other company. However, Apple's first attempt at, well, I'm still not calling the M1 a desktop processor, but the M1 is a better first attempt than most other firsts. As far as 3D design work, overall, I was impressed with the performance. Even the weaker points I mentioned, like viewport rendering in Maya, the fact that I was able to see some of the detail I needed to within 10 to 15 seconds was better than I expected. And the strong points were very strong. I was just as impressed with the modeling performance, particularly in zBrush, as I was with the digital art performance in Photoshop. Be sure to check that video out if you missed it. So, in the world of 3D designers and artists, who is the iMac for? Simply put, the 3D design hobbyist. If you do some or all of what I demonstrated today for fun and personal satisfaction, then the iMac is a solid option. However, if you do any of that stuff professionally or want to do it professionally, like you want a computer to make money doing 3D design, then this isn't it. Keep in mind, like I've been trying to do throughout my entire testing of this, the 2021 24-inch M1 iMac is now Apple's entry-level desktop computer. It's taken the place, in a big way, of the now discontinued 21.5-inch iMac. It isn't intended to be a professional workstation. And I think I'll just leave it at that. If you have any questions, be sure to ask in the comments below. Also, it'd be great if you hit that like on the way out. It really helps get the content of a small channel like mine out there to more people with similar interests. And be sure to get subscribed so we can grow the community. I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, stay safe.